A teenage girl disappears into the dark near the St. Tammany Parish Fairgrounds in Covington, Louisiana. Not long after that, Roxanne Sharp is found in a wooded area nearby. She is 16 years old. Investigators say she was raped and murdered. And then the case does something that can be almost as haunting as the crime itself. It goes quiet. For more than 4 decades, Roxanne's name hangs over that town like a question nobody can answer. Who killed her? What happened in those final moments? And how does a murder like this stay unsolved for 44 years when it happened in a place where people knew each other, talked to each other, and remembered exactly where they were when the news spread? That is the story. And what makes it even more striking is the way this old case finally broke open. Not with one dramatic confession, not with a detective stumbling onto one perfect clue, but through years of persistence, newer DNA testing, and something almost nobody would have predicted back in 1982. A podcast. To understand why that mattered, you have to go back to Covington at the start of the 1980s. In February of 1982, Covington was the kind of town where routines felt familiar and steady. People knew the roads, they knew the neighborhoods, they knew the fairgrounds. A place like that can feel safe right up until the moment something terrible happens. Then every ordinary corner starts to look different. That was the shock Roxanne Sharp's murder left behind. She was just 16, young enough that the loss hit with a special kind of cruelty. This was not some distant headline about a stranger in another state. This was a local girl, found dead in the woods near a place people recognized. The details alone were enough to shake the community. But what came next may have shaped the case just as much as the killing itself. Fear. In the early days, investigators worked the case with the tools they had. They gathered evidence, they chased leads, they tried to piece together what happened to Roxanne and who had been with her. But 1982 was a very different world for a murder investigation. There was no social media pushing stories back into public view. No modern DNA methods ready to pull answers from tiny traces. No huge online networks where tips could spread in minutes. If witnesses held back, if rumors stayed private, if people were too afraid to speak plainly, a case could start slipping away almost immediately. And that appears to be what happened here. Over time, the investigation slowed. The urgency of the first days gave way to the long grind of an unsolved murder. The case became the kind detectives inherit instead of solve. Roxanne's family was left with grief and no clear ending. The town was left with rumors, questions, and the heavy feeling that somebody out there knew more than they had ever admitted. At one point, the case drifted toward a name that has floated through more than one old murder investigation in America. Henry Lee Lucas. Lucas became infamous for confessing to crimes he did not commit. For a while, his name being linked to Roxanne Sharp's killing may have sounded like movement, it may have sounded like an answer, but like so many of his confessions, that lead collapsed, and when it did, the case fell right back into the dark. That kind of false hope can do real damage. For a family, it opens the door just enough to make the next disappointment even worse. For investigators, it burns time. For a community, it creates the illusion that the truth is close when it still is not. So the years kept moving. Children grew up, streets changed, officers retired, and new ones took their place. People who had been young when Roxanne died became middle-aged, then elderly. But the case never really disappeared. It just stayed there in the background, like something the town couldn't quite shake. One person later described it as a black cloud over the community. That sounds about right, because an unsolved murder does not stay locked in one old file cabinet. It lives in memory. It comes back in conversations. It gets carried by the victim's family. It gets passed between detectives. And sometimes it settles over a place so completely that people stop expecting it to ever lift. Then, decades later, something changed. By 2023, Louisiana State Police investigators in the Covington field office took over the case and started pushing again. They went back through the old file, they re-interviewed witnesses, they looked again at possible suspects, they gathered what new material they could, and they sent evidence back out for DNA analysis using technology that did not exist when Roxanne was killed. That alone gave the case a chance it had never really had before. Across the country, cold cases have been reopened by science. Old samples that once seemed useless can suddenly matter. Tiny traces can speak when earlier methods could not. Assumptions from decades ago can be tested instead of trusted. A case that used to feel frozen can start moving again. But in Roxanne Sharp's case, technology was only part of the story. The other part came from public attention. A local podcast called Who Killed Roxanne Sharp brought the case back into the open. And at first, that almost sounds too neat to be real. A podcast helping solve a murder from 1982? It sounds like the kind of headline people would roll their eyes at. Except, police later said it helped. The series put Roxanne's story back in front of the public. It reminded listeners that this was not some closed chapter from the past. It gave people a way to hear the case laid out again. And maybe most important of all, it gave witnesses, or people connected to witnesses, a reason to finally speak. That matters when a case has been shaped by silence. After the arrests were announced, investigators said earlier efforts had been hurt by a culture of fear among people connected to the case. That phrase says a lot. A culture of fear. It suggests this was not simply a mystery with no clues. It suggests people may have known more than they ever said. It suggests the truth may have been living close to the community all along, protected not by genius or luck, but by intimidation and quiet. The podcast helped crack that quiet open. As people listened, new tips came in. New witnesses came forward. Investigators were able to sharpen the timeline around Roxanne's final days. The distance between the teenage girl she had been and the place where she was found started to narrow. And then, in April 2026, the case suddenly moved from old memory into present-day arrests. Authorities announced that 4 men had been charged in connection with Roxanne Sharp's death. Perry Wayne Taylor, Daryl Dean Spell, Carlos Cooper, and Billy Williams Jr. The charges were aggravated rape and second-degree murder. Police said Roxanne had known the accused men and was known to spend time in the neighborhood where they lived. Even that detail changes the way you hear the story. It means this was not described as some random stranger attack by somebody passing through. It places Roxanne in a world of familiar people and familiar surroundings, which somehow makes the danger feel even closer. A 16-year-old girl spending time around people she knew, then ending up dead in the woods near the fairgrounds. By the time the charges were announced, 2 of the accused men, Taylor and Cooper, were already in prison on unrelated matters. Williams was arrested in Covington. Spell was arrested in Ohio and awaited extradition back to Louisiana. And after 44 years, the town finally heard names. Now, it is important to stop there and be careful. These were charges, not convictions. The case still has to move through court. Evidence will have to be tested. The prosecution's claims will have to stand up under scrutiny. That part matters, especially in a case this old, where memories fade and every detail has to be handled with care. But even with that caution, the arrests were a shock. 44 years is long enough for people to believe justice is never coming. Long enough for a victim to become known mainly through the phrase cold case. Long enough for time itself to start looking stronger than the investigation. And yet, this case came back. For Roxanne's family, that kind of moment must feel almost impossible to describe. Not healing exactly. Nothing heals what happened to a 16-year-old girl. Nothing gives back the years. Nothing restores the life that should have kept unfolding. But there is a difference between grief and endless uncertainty. Roxanne's niece said she hoped justice would finally bring healing and closure, not only for the family, but for everyone who had carried the case for so long. And maybe that's the best way to understand what this moment means. Not a happy ending, not a repaired past, just the end of one kind of waiting. There is also something bigger in this case, something that reaches beyond Covington. For years, true crime has been criticized for turning suffering into content. Sometimes that criticism is fair, but the Roxanne Sharp case points to another possibility. Sometimes public storytelling does not bury the truth under entertainment. Sometimes it helps drag the truth back into the light. In this case, police themselves said the podcast helped generate new information. That does not make the story less unsettling. If anything, it makes it more unsettling, because it raises a hard question. If the answers were not lost forever, then where were they? How much was buried in old fear? How much sat inside memories people never shared? How many years did this case remain unsolved, not because it was impossible, but because silence held it in place? One person involved in revisiting the case said that retracing the old scene made it clear Roxanne was likely grabbed off the street and dragged into the woods. If that account is correct, It leaves you with a brutal picture: a teenager in a familiar area, a short distance between normal life and absolute horror, trees close to a road, a neighborhood nearby, and then a crime that the town would carry for the next 4 decades. That is part of what gives this case its weight. Roxanne Sharp was not just a name in a headline. She was a 16-year-old girl whose future should have been wide open. Instead, for years her story existed in fragments. There was the person her family remembered, and there was the victim trapped in an unsolved file. The arrests do not erase that gap, but they do narrow it. They say this story is still being answered. And maybe that is what makes the Roxanne Sharp case stay with people. It is not only about a terrible crime. It is about what time can fail to do. Time was supposed to blur this. It was supposed to wear down memories, weaken the evidence, scatter the witnesses, and bury Roxanne under decades of other tragedies. Instead, her case came roaring back in 2026. Not solved in the full legal sense, not finished, but moving. After 44 years, that black cloud over Covington may finally be starting to break. What happens next will happen in court, where the evidence will be tested and the charges will either hold or they will not. But one thing is already clear: Roxanne Sharp was not forgotten, and after all those years of silence, her story forced its way back into the present. As always, visit us at readtherealstory.com for more unbelievable true stories. Until next time, stay curious.